Good afternoon. Oh, well, I hope everybody had a nice, refreshing lunch and got out there in the sunshine. It's a hard, long day sometimes going to symposia and being inside. I'm teaching this class this term, and it's with 80 freshmen in it, and it's their first time being in what we call in art history darkness at noon. When the lights are out. And I had this one young man come up to me about a week or so ago, and he said, "Professor Shaw, could you lecture with the lights on?" And I said, "Well, what's the problem?" And he said, "Well, I just can't seem to stay awake during your lecture." I said, "Well, I'll try and be more interesting." So I thought it was cute. Not. I also suggested that he wait and eat lunch after class, right? So anyway, I'm Gwendolyn DuBois. I want to welcome you back to our afternoon session, which is on pedagogy and artistic practice. Following that, we'll have some artistic practice, but it won't be practice anymore. It will be the perfect, exactly, it will be perfect. In the courtyard in the Great Hall, artist Sheldon Scott will be performing a piece called Precious Underwater, a portrait of the Geechee. It's part of the National Portrait Gallery's Identify series, and I'm really excited about this. Last year, I was so pleased to meet Sheldon and to get to know him. I conducted an extensive interview with him, which is in the most recent issue of Transition. I urge you to check it out. If you have access to JSTOR, you can get it online through JSTOR. Or you can buy it. It's paper also. Transition, it comes in paper, and you can buy it and read it in the bathtub, right? Sheldon's presentation will examine the advent of rice as a cash crop and the subsequent commodification of the black body. I understand, and I've said this before, that various parts of this presentation have been supported by the Smithsonian in different ways, including growing 100 rice plants of Carolina gold rice for the performance. So it should be a very unique thing. Organizing this symposium over the past year was an exciting experience for me. I not only was honored to work with the many members of the museum staff, but I also met fascinating artists like Sheldon working in the area. I became reacquainted with other artists who I had met before but hadn't seen, and being in a different region. Amy Sherald, for example, who was the winner of the Uwumbu Cheever portraiture competition, which is on view upstairs. I had met Amy several years back, and it was great to see her career kind of like blossoming this year. Her work is also on the cover of the Archives of American Art Journal special issue, which just came out to celebrate the new new Museum of African American Culture and History. So it's really been fantastic in that regard. I also learned a lot from extended conversations with art consultant Jessica Stafford Davis and Kaya Black, who works here at the NPG, and who helped Sheldon to realize his vision for Precious Underwater. Through the conversations I had with these artists and arts professionals, my enthusiasm for this symposium grew, and at the same time, so did my level of anxiety. In my own experience from teaching, researching, and writing on art made by contemporary African American artists, such as Robert Colescott, Carrie Mae Weems, Kara Walker, who was the subject of my first book, and Glenn Ligon, all of whose work deals unflinchingly with complicated issues around race, class, gender, sexuality, and representation, it can be hard to be critical, to critically engage such work without engendering a good bit of controversy and criticism back at you, right? Some of it which is affirmative and generative. I'm always happy to hear from young scholars in particular who've used my work in different ways, how much it meant to them. But also, it can be disheartening and depressing, to work on subjects which upset people, and then, you get branded. Right, you get branded, you become the nasty art historian who talks about things that should not be talked about, and that only some artists, particularly in African American art collecting circles, art supporting circles. There are some artists who are so transgressive that they seem to disrupt the whole cycle. And so even writing about them can be seen as an act of, an apologetic act, and so it's not always easy. So these issues of, so in my experience, not only writing about these things in the world of academic art history, but in working at and with museums, the issues of race and representation, equity versus equality, which are really two different things, and what it really means to study oneself and to serve one's community, these are some of the most contentious problems with which one can grapple. Where I might have once gone eagerly into the fray, I now hesitate a bit before dipping a toe. I am less interested nowadays in getting bitten by any lurking alligators that might be out there than I once was. But artists who engage histories of race and the problems of racial masquerade in their work put themselves out there in a way that is so much more impressive and so much braver than anything I could ever say about that work. I stand in awe of the important work that artists like Michael Ray Charles and Beverly McEver, who unfortunately can't join us today because she's very ill, about the things that they've accomplished in their painting practices, pushing the boundaries and never, ever looking back, which is why I felt it was so necessary to have a panel on pedagogy and artistic practice. And to introduce this panel, I've chosen to exercise a little pedagogical moment myself, and I've asked Jill Vaum, whose upcoming dissertation on images of minstrelsy and racial representation in the 19th century painting and visual culture I'm honored to be advising. I first met Jill when she was a freshman, taking my contemporary art lecture at Penn, and since then she has finished a BA in art history from Vanderbilt, where she worked closely with my good colleague Vivian Fried. She's also completed a curatorial fellowship at the Frisch Center, where she helped to mount the recent major retrospective of Carrie Mae Weems's work, which was at the Guggenheim Museum. They actually organized that at the Frisch, although the Guggenheim seems to have kind of claimed it in that New York way, right? She wrote a fantastic master's thesis, which she'll talk a little bit about, on Carrie James Marshall's work. And she also served as the right hand and the editorial assistant for my recent exhibition and catalog, Represent African American Art, at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I have a great deal of respect for Jill, and I'm so pleased that she's here to introduce this panel. Please welcome Jill Vaum.
I want to thank the National Portrait Gallery for their support of this weekend's events, as well as the speakers, whose exciting and generative scholarship we heard last night and this morning. And I especially want to thank Gwendolyn for giving me the opportunity to participate in this conversation. This weekend's presentations have been particularly valuable for my own graduate work, as Gwendolyn suggested, which examines the representation of racial types in the 19th century United States. I'm interested in how caricatures from popular culture, often those performed on the minstrel stage, affected the depiction of African American subjects as individuals in fine art. The prompt to explore this question came from encounters with the work of several contemporary artists, including today's panelist, Michael Ray Charles, who confront the at times vexing and others liberating intersection of performance, race, image making, and historic representation. My master's thesis, like Gwendolyn said, focused on an early self-portrait by Carrie James Marshall, an artist who shares these concerns. I hope that a few remarks on this project will be a productive primer for the discussion of masquerade within painting to follow. In the thesis, I considered how Marshall mobilized various iconography, materials, and techniques that had historically distorted the Black body in images. because these elements themselves constitute the painting. The artist's self-portrait, made in 1980 at the outset of his career, addressed the historic misrepresentation, perhaps we could call it disfiguration, of the Black body in visual art, and the challenges facing contemporary artists hoping to draw from historic precedent. Among the many histories that Marshall looks to is blackface minstrelsy. The performances of white actors blacking up to enact racial caricatures, an established stage presence in the urban North by the 1840s, generated a huge body of imagery of deformed, exaggerated, and outlandish Black bodies in printed media like playbills, sheet music covers, and broadsides. In this context, the masquerade of Blackness became stilled in 2-dimension, and the stage fictions became the early stock in trade for representing African Americans. As a result, Black figures became trapped in the guise of the performer. Through the later 19th and 20th centuries, the stereotypes born in the theatrical setting of minstrelsy were printed in color and moved beyond musical ephemera into the realms of fine art, children's toys and books, household goods, and commercial advertisements,
crossing national boundaries, ethnic boundaries, racial boundaries, class boundaries, gender boundaries. Here he is as Frida Kahlo on the right. You probably recognize it, and maybe less well known is his portrait of himself as Air Rose C'est la Vie, which is of course a redo of a Duchamp work. So Duchamp was performing in drag or femininity, and here is Yasumasa crossing a whole other set of boundaries to do similar work. Howardina Pindell and Hennessy, what's his first name?
Oh, Jason Musson? Hennessy
Yeah, so Jason Musson, but Hennessy, I can't remember. Youngman, thank you. And Hennessy Youngman, very important kind of art context of people donning new identities in order to have conversations with interlocutors within the space of the art world. And then finally, the class ended with a segment on transgender. And there was an episode of Transparent that we studied along with Vaginal Cream Davis, whose work you can see on the left. What people don't think about with Transparent, for example, is that it is as much a consideration, a meditation on Jewish identity in Los Angeles, middle or upper middle class Jewish identity in Los Angeles, as much as it is a consideration or meditation on gender and transgender. So that is the pedagogical work that I do in this area. It is difficult stuff to teach. It is highly rewarding. One of the things that I do find is that oftentimes people do not feel comfortable talking about a race that is not their own or an ethnicity that is not their own. And so it can make for very stallting start and stop conversation. But once people kind of drop their, I think, proprietary claims to their own ethnicity, then the real conversation gets started. Speaking of conversation starting, Michael Ray, will you come up, please?
I was enjoying it. Well, good one to start with. Put that one up.
Oh, I was going to sit there. Thank you. So I will tell you that we were colleagues in the art and art history department in the University of Texas for about 9 years, and that Michael Ray was on the search committee that hired me about 15 years ago. So the challenge for me will be to bring you all into conversations that we have been having for the last 10 years. So bear with us as we bring you into conversations that we have been having for a while now. Okay, here we go. So I am putting up one of my favorite pieces of Michael Ray's work, and that is Sam. So I'll tell you a little story before I get started, and that is that we have a mutual friend whose name is Rudy Green. Rudy is a very devoted collector of Michael Ray's work and friend of his, and he has the most beautiful, I've never seen it hanging, I've only seen it on the ground when it's been pulled out from a closet, but a beautiful painting of a rooster, of a cock that has been rendered in tar. Mm. One of his earliest works when he began to make work in this style, in this mature style, I will say. And so this piece, Sam, which also features a rooster or a cock, is one of my favorites because it reminds me of this other work in tar. Now, the tar work is very expressive, as is this work, Sam, that you see in front of you. And so the first question I'm going to ask you is about the expressive expressionist brushstrokes of this work? How did you arrive there?
I would start by saying this happened just on the back end of my MFA program at U of H, and it was a program that I felt I was not getting. Turn this down. Is it possible to turn it down? Do I have the control?
No, you don't.
Put it lower on your chest.
Is this better? Yeah. Yeah, I felt like I wasn't getting the type of feedback that I needed, and it took me out of the context of the art department. And in doing so, I began to incorporate other or employ other disciplines, and to seek ways to understand the value that was in my work. So it was freeing in that sense, and the mark making then followed thereafter. So the layering began. I started exploring ideas about being more assertive and not just mimicking or making work that looked like something other than just being more intentional in terms of what types of decisions I was making.
I'm going to move this forward.
Are you going to go through each one of them like this?
No, I'm actually showing the audience some of the things that you're using in SAM now. So the flag image of Uncle Sam, along with this work of from the White Studios that is of Bert Williams. And so what you see is that there is quite a bit of appropriation that's involved in that work, but that it's kind of digested appropriation. It's not readily visible. And so how did you come upon this style of appropriation?
You know, I at this point, I'm looking at blackface images and wanting to get past the surface of the images. And I remember doing some reading on Bert Williams, and I ran across this particular image. Oh, that particular image. And as I continued to ponder that image, I realized that it was the first time I got the concept of a black man acting as a white man acting black. So hence, I put a white mask on in my version. And I realized that that is one of the things that I continue to deal with in my work. And that's an idea that persists, that the limitations of possibilities are linked to how well, it's not necessarily linked to occupying that other position, but how you navigate or in relationship to that other position. You know, I think of, I think of concepts of like blackness as being tragic, because in all of its attempts, it could never be its other, or truly occupy its other.
I have some thoughts on that, but I'm gonna let them sit for a moment. So this comes immediately on the heels of Sam and of the tar painting that I just mentioned to you. This is Beware from 1994. And so you see here that he is beginning to really employ these symbols of stereotypes of black culture in the work and doing something different with them. You might say that, someone might say that they display confrontation or anger, but maybe the thing that they most express is a wariness or a head shaking, a kind of realization that this joke that is how people have imagined Black people is not right?
You know, I have to remove myself. I try my best to remove my personal biases from approaching the images from minstrelsy, other representations of Blackness, and particularly in the 19th century, and to try and address them in a way that brings forth what I think are more important issues. First of all, it may be a more specific representation or reference to a Black or Blackness, but ultimately I feel that it is a shared representation of whites and Blacks, because I don't think you could have one part and not the other. And as I begin to think about and use and explore the use of certain types of images from 19th century, my concerns really were with what were the types, how were they produced, where were they produced, why were they produced, what were the consistent kinds of ways that they've been produced, and in an attempt to understand what was some sort of hidden language. And in my attempts to do so, oh, baby? Outstanding. I began to go back and forth. And what I mean by that, things opened up in a different way. I could use a reference like Mickey Mouse, for example, only to discover at some point that one of my favorite painters, Thomas Hart Benton, had used Mickey Mouse, and in fact was the first to use Mickey Mouse in one of his murals. So the reflecting back on culture that manifests itself in a different way, that embodies similar characteristics to language that was prominent, I think, that existed in minstrelsy, but as well as in 19th century America, in images from Puck, Judge Magazine, and
I've got some examples behind you
yes,
now.
exactly. And more so political cartooning from 19th century.
That I don't have. I'm back to the where now.
And I would also say that drawing upon my not only my interest in advertisement, but having studied design and advertising, and I began to go back into popular culture because I felt like that was a place where the language that was constructed to reflect and attract, encourage, solicit, instruct, again, people, was a language that was linked to how bodies moved in space. In other words, it was a relationship there. So, more back into looking at language and text and image, and Lucien Bernhardt, for example, where earlier use of a dominant image with text used in advertising. Thinking about the design components, but also different implications of meaning. So hence beware, as both to suggest caution, but also in relationship to the image. I think it allows the viewer to choose what degree of caution, because it appears to be a humorous image, a figure that's diminished in size, which is something I've circled back towards because of the idea of deformity and dwarfs and the diminished figures in 19th century political cartooning, which was also often used as a way of taking power away from whomever the image was reflecting.
Mm-hmm. So this piece is made in 1994. This would be maybe 2 years into your tenure track process at the University of Texas.
Yeah.
What was it like to make work about minstrelsy as you are performing a particular identity in order to get tenure?
Well, let me see. That's okay. So, which aspect of the performance was it? The artist performing as a scholar and the academic, or the black male performing as a white male, or a black performing as white? Ask me that question again.
You made this work a couple of years into being on the tenure track to becoming a tenured professor.
Mm-hmm.
That's a statement, that's not a question. The thing that I'm asking you is, what is it to meditate on, what does it mean for you to meditate on these various performances in your work, even while you are having to, as we all do, by the way, when we are in our professional lives, trying to adopt an identity, the identity of the professor in this case, or to perform that in relation to your colleagues in your department?
I don't know where to start with that one, I'll be honest with you. But, you know, I was really focused on the images and really trying to deconstruct the images and deconstruct or discover what type of hidden language that existed. I guess I had blinders on, and it never, the whole professorship thing was, it was an objective, given the fact that I'm in academia, but it wasn't, I just focused on the work, as I still try to do. But I would say over the years, or through the years, I have been able to really kind of step back and think about the kind of complexities of the dimensions that you're suggesting. And they are, for me, at times somewhat productive, and at times not so productive. I had a professor, no, he was an artist, once tell me, never become a professor. And I try to listen to it. I hear it often, actually. Vincent Moriani, studied with Joseph Albert. And I didn't know what he meant, but I know now. Didn't know then.
So can you reflect back on this mid-1990s, late 1990s moment when Carrie Weems is thinking about black memorabilia, Fred Wilson, Kara Walker, you, David Leventhal, for example.
Mm-hmm.
There are moments when there's a kind of groundswell, or it's in the culture that people are thinking about a particular set of symbols or icons. How did you get here, and how to these works? And did you have conversations with others of that moment about a similar thinking through, cathartic examination, those kinds of things?
You know, David Leventhal and I met several times while I was in New York, and David introduced me to his collection of memorabilia, which was amazing. And of course, the presentation of it in this place was amazing. And you know, I would always talk about ask questions about the origins of certain things, and I don't think he was so much interested in that, more so than he was talking about specific ones that he had in his collection. And you know, this person is not an artist, but a collector of sorts. Steve Heller is another person who I would talk with, and Steve and I would talk about different things as it pertains to concepts surrounding a lot of the memorabilia. But my use derives from an attempt to understand who, what, where, when, and how the certain types come into play, and when they came into play, who constructed them, what was the intent, try to understand the language, and most importantly, how the language extends beyond the original inception into 20th and 21st century. So Black memorabilia for me, is an interesting construction of assortment of things. And over the years, I've collected a number. I was primarily looking at images, two-dimensional images, and you know, lithography, print, photographs, of course, early 20th century, late 19th century. But then I began to kind of bump into the three-dimensional objects, and the Jolly Nigger Bank, and the many variations of images of black heads, which at some point became very influential in a sculpture and in a number of paintings. If one looks at Staffordshire pottery, and when Staffordshire pottery begins to come into play in American culture.
You can't hear us?
Yes, we have these, which will work a little bit better to cut that noise out.
Okay.
Yeah, so Staffordshire pottery for me was looking at the influences of ideas that came with European immigrants to the United States. Particularly, these were objects that depicted the Queen, military, higher-ups, and eventually the Staffordshire pottery begins to depict popular culture in America. So you see one of the earlier examples is a depiction of Thomas Rice, who, and by many acclaims, was one of the starters or the founding, or the foundation of 19th century minstrelsy. But after the depiction of Rice, there are references to classicism, which were ideas that were prominent in the 19th century. There were depictions that came from and were inspired by Uncle Tom's Cabin literature. And then I think at some point, certain images that were discovered in southern Italy made their way into American museums, and American illustrators had access to them. And then certain types of images came from that, and therefore influencing a lot of the Black memorabilia, particularly in the three-dimensional form, as well as in 2D form because of advertisement at that time.
I'm going to move forward because this one is going to talk to that. So we've already touched a little bit on advertisements. We've touched on pottery and the two-dimensional rendering of figures. And then there's also illustration, which relates to the earlier Uncle Sam image, but these Norman Rockwell images and other kind of Saturday Evening Post illustrated magazines from early part and middle part of the 20th century. So when you're looking at Michael Ray's work, what you see are certain symbols or icons, iconography that get repeated over and over. So there is a figure with a large head. There is a figure with large lips. There might be a white gloved figure. So there's one thing about the kind of sociological aspect of Black memorabilia and all of the history that goes along with it, but then there is the straight visual image, the formal qualities of this work that you bring to bear in your paintings and other works. So could you talk about those visual signs, those visual icons or iconography that you deploy in your work?
You know, Norman Rockwell, I've been a huge fan of his work, as well as Joseph Leondecker, for example. They were, as artists first, both were trained artists, and I really appreciate the fact that despite their training, they chose to do what they wanted to do, and that was illustration. And Rockwell, and I knew of both Rockwell and Leondecker's work, or Leondecker's work, through representations of Saturday Evening Post. But there was a distinct difference, I think, between them. And with Rockwell, for me, it was, I think he managed to, oh,
I'm sorry.
it seems really loud over here.
You can't hear it. We're getting a little bit of static, so
Okay.
we turned the lapel mics off. But
Yeah.
if you could speak into the microphone.
Gotcha.
See how that goes.
Iconography.
Yes. No problem. I wanted to reference American culture. I wanted to constantly have that presence of American culture and certain iconic things that resonated within the collective consciousness. And minstrelsy was that, and for much of the 19th century. And moving forward, I thought with Rockwell's work, as well as the Saturday Evening Post, was one of these things that managed to both reflect aspects of American culture and absorb it at the same time. So it was using that, but also using it for just my appreciation for it within the American cultural context, but also for other reasons as well. Sort of, I think of it as being somewhat instructional.
So you studied advertising and design as an undergraduate, and there is a real attention to a kind of illustrated page or how a cohesive design can be impactful. And then you use some of those same maneuvers in your own work to make things that either look like posters or look like covers of magazines, sometimes book covers, but there is implicit in them, at least in this early work, the recognition of the kind of commercialism of illustration and of art. So could you talk about that? What you learned from studying advertisement?
Well, you know, I mean, it is this machine that binds us all within a context of where so much emphasis is placed on consumerism. How the language is shaped, how the package is shaped or designed, the fonts, the size of the font, the scale. There's a lot of meaning within all of those things, even product placement, the quality of materials used, how does it feel in your hand, all of those kinds of things. For me, language exists, and I wanted to not only reference them, but explore them.
Move forward. This Liberty Brothers Permanent Daily Circus Blue period, you might get that it is referencing Picasso and his blue period, but also thinking through blues as in depression or melancholia. This work, for me, really kind of gets at the real problematic place that a person like Bert Williams had to have been in because of his donning the blackface in his work. Can you hear me okay now? Yeah. And that he was ostracized for doing it, but on the other hand, it was really the only livelihood that he was able to have in his chosen profession of being a performer at that given moment in time. And so, yeah, could you talk about how a work like this blue period is focusing on or thinking about the weight of such performances?
You know, looking at, artists or creative types that I'm among, and of course, many of which that have come before me, I think the freedom that we have to create now so often did not. We don't understand how significant and important it was for performers like Walker and Bert Williams and others, Hubie Blake, for example, Sammy Davis Jr., and the many creative performers of the 19th century, and that they had to perform within these really limited ways. And this is something I often think about when referencing and appropriating certain images. I like to think that when I'm all done, that there is a common string about the African experience in my work that stretches across the waters. But while it's here, it touches upon and references all sorts of things within popular culture, and I try to explore those intersections. And one of those, a big one for me is just sitting and contemplating having to perform in such a limited capacity. So I would say towards the end of blackface minstrelsy, black performers were no longer blacking up and began to perform the same sort of minstrel sets, but without donning the makeup. But I do think about a lot of the weight of the pressure of those performers early on. Sammy Davis Jr. came up last night, and it's another person who I can't say that I've done much research on. As you know, I'm a huge Michael Jackson fan, and Michael Jackson was a huge fan of Sammy Davis Jr. And I'd like to think that glove, that one glove, that it is truly an acknowledgement to those early performers. It is the entertainer's glove.
Mm-hmm. So related to that, this image has the figure of the clown, which is a different image than just the black-faced figure, or the minstrel image that Bert Williams has in the photograph. Could you talk with us about the draw of the clown?
Yeah. Obviously, thinking about minstrel performers, the comedic aspect, or component to minstrelsy, notions of deformity, the kind of classic idea of the white body within art, and in opposition, the deformed, dwarf, exaggerated, distorted, made to be whatever other black body. And one of the things that I found as an intersection was that the clown was and is often continued to be used in contemporary film with regards to black representation, particularly black males. My first kind of use of the clown actually goes back to undergraduate. And I did this drawing of a clown, excuse me, of a clown in a mirror drinking. And the reflection in the mirror was totally different from the reflection that was peering back to the surface. And it is something that I've explored in my work and in many instances, thinking about the mime, Fouti and Chocolat, a French slapstick clown duo, the relationship to Camelia de Arte, and of course, trying to understand how do we get from red lips, big red lips, and the white around the eyes to the white around the mouth. There is, in my opinion, a relationship to the clown. And I think in terms of, and you could cut me off at any point because I'm probably going to say something inaccurate. I think in terms of depictions of blacks in 19th century America, with the use and the limitations of lithography, right? You had black and you had red, and then it wasn't until the latter 1860s or so you had the intersection between fine arts and commercial art, and you had lithography or chromolithography, where several colors were employed. But prior to that, there was only two colors that were being used. And I've combed through many images, particularly sheet music, and did not find not so much of an emphasis on exaggerations of the lips as really being red and big until you get to the latter half of the 19th century, when I think a number of certain artifacts, again, had made their way into American museums, in Boston Museum, I think Philadelphia, in the form of 4th century Apulia vases, Janus heads, some of the work that Frank Snowden, images from the work that Frank Snowden did.
So if you didn't catch that, he just went from the 19th century to Roman pottery.
Yes, thanks for grounding that.
I'm sorry, what? Yes. Okay. It sounds like I'm going to take questions from you now. Janet.
I don't know if this is off the topic or not, but Michael Ray, one of the things that's always enticed me about your work is the beautiful surfaces, the distressed surfaces, which are, and I think the only one you really showed here that did that was Beware, but there are many
This
others.
one does too.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true. They're very beautiful to me, and I just wanted to know what you would say about that, and is that part of the message for you? It's obviously deliberate, but anything you'd like to say about that, I'd like to hear.
Well, I think there's a beauty in things that have lived, things that weathered surfaces. I've always been attracted to those things, but also the presence of the past. I guess it's the presence of the past. So wanting to, it's a part of my process of working that you don't see in the images of the crutches, language and conversation, I don't know if that comes up, but it's a part that allows me to really physically be engaged with the work in a different way than in a different way. So a lot of this, the structure of this piece had to do with thinking of ideas and trying to find an intersection between the use of materials, the general idea of wanting to use, having the limitations of having to put a sculpture, 30 feet high, is that ceiling?
Yeah.
30 feet high in a very small space. So the best part of this was when I was able to really get physical with putting this thing together, but conceiving the different wheels of 8 wheels, I don't know if you can see those, of assemblage of crutches was one part, and I have specific ideas about why I did those things, but the best part was just being physical with it, and that's one part of the process.
So I happen to office in the building that has this sculpture, and it's very fun to be underneath it, but then to walk onto the 3rd floor of the building to look into it. And when you look into it, you see the undulating pattern of these star figures that have a kind of central hub, and then all of the crutches radiate out from them. Looks like there's a question over here.
Yes, first of all, Michael Ray Charles, I was privileged to get one of your poster series a long, long time ago, coming from one of the exhibitions that you did on stereotypes, and still value that very much. So, and I really appreciate your discussion. Eddie Murphy has come up in several discussions, and I've always thought of him, especially in the early Saturday Night Live days, as doing blackface and blackface, and really playing to specifically a white audience. And there are some other folks who do that even now, and other actors who don't. But I think that the depiction of, or the ways that African American performers, comedians present themselves have very subtle differences, but they're very important. So my question is, in terms of contrasting someone like Eddie Murphy, who's done blackface and whiteface at this moment, and someone like Dave Chappelle, do you have any comments on that performance of blackness for large audiences, for general audiences?
Can I
Convoluted.
have you take a look behind you at, I was hoping to get to that very question myself, because I think it's an important one. Here are examples of what someone might think of as contemporary blackface, and I want to thank Mia for bringing the Beyonce image to my attention. But here is a Moschino ad, And I sometimes think of NWA, for example, as contemporary blackface, and I know I'm going to upset a lot of people by saying that. But Michael Ray.
So am I talking about
No, you're talking about
Eddie Murphy and
blackface.
performance and Dave Chappelle? Where do I start? I mean, you know, so many of Eddie Murphy's movies, I think he's performing black, and occasionally he's performing black and white, like Coming to America. I just said earlier, he does both in one scene. One of my favorite scenes. The boy's good.
Barbershop.
You know,
Barbershop. Do you remember that scene in Coming to America? He's like 4 different
yeah,
characters.
Exactly. Yeah. When they talk about Clay and Cassius Clay, which was an interesting clip, but Chappelle's I think was quite interesting in relationship to images I've looked at of Eddie Murphy. Did I find him funny? Hell yeah. In the context of comedy, yes. And I think there were moments when the comedy, both Chappelle and Eddie Murphy, was being used, not unlike some of the ways that I construct images. And that is, it's intended to be assertive in a certain way. It's sort of like the drum beat, ba-da-ba-ba, ping, and at the end of perhaps a dead joke, but that dead joke might in fact be something that's really pronounced, you know. So has it been useful? I think, yeah, but I think there has to be both sides. I think the critique has to be there, and also the acknowledgement of the past has to be there. But in the context of comedians, they have a range like no other.
Can I add something to that? I think that a lot of what you're getting at has to do with audience and context. And so if we're thinking about Dave Chappelle, does he imagine that he's talking to someone like me or someone that's like him? Or are you thinking about Eddie Murphy working in this Saturday Night Live context of him talking to a mainstream America, which is going to largely be white with a smaller population of people of color? So I do think it's to think through if he's performing a stereotype of blackness really means that we have to think through who he is performing to, or for whom he assumes is going to receive his performance.
But I would also say that, Eddie is a little older than I am, but we're still talking about performances that are taking place in the post-civil rights context. I think the bigger question is, could they have gotten away with that in the 50s and 60s and the 70s? No. I don't think our culture was ready for that. I think our culture was trying to get as far away from those kinds of things as possible. But I think a post-civil rights generation has had the ability to kind of interrogate some of those concepts like other generations perhaps have not had the chance to do so.
What the expectations are of a black performer.
Yes.
They could interrogate them. Looks like there's another question.
Hello, and thank you very much. I was just wondering, when did you paint Elvis Lives? I didn't write that down.
Ooh.
The one where it's like a photo of Elvis with dark makeup on.
I want to say mid-90s. I did a whole series on Elvis. I'm a huge Elvis fan.
Okay. As a viewer, I'm wondering if what I receive from it is what you intended for me to receive. And one is that his famous hound dog was actually appropriated from an earlier version. Mm-hmm. But secondly, there's something, well, not this one, actually the other one, the other one, the early, well,
I think that was
I mean, because what I want to mention is even more kind of in your face than this one.
I'm not sure which image
Well,
is
wasn't
it.
it like, it was actually a photograph of Elvis? That was yours, right, with the blackface?
No.
I don't
Oh,
think
that was somebody else?
I don't think that's Elvis.
Okay. Yeah, there- it was much earlier than this.
Oh, earlier.
Yeah. So basically, Elvis has a holster, he's got blackface, and he's like this. And the reason I asked when you painted it, because, you know, in the times we live in, where so many incidents and deaths have happened, because either someone mistakes something in a black man's hand and says, well, it looked like a gun, and there's Elvis has a holster, but it's a microphone. But in the other one I'm talking about, the mic is as if he's just taking it from the holster. And I didn't know if that was just a coincidence that
No.
could be very meaningful today in that sense, or?
I think that particular one was more so about sort of a subtle jab at art history. Of course, Warhol did the Elvis series, and that particular position came from Elvis. And I think it came from Love Me Tender, the movie Love Me Tender. But, you know, Elvis, I did a number of paintings about Elvis because of, you know, Elvis's manager said that if he felt if he could find a white man who sung like a nigger, he'd make you a millionaire. And that's some, you know, on record, and I guess he did. But Elvis intrigues me in many ways, and one way in particular is sort of challenging the innocent notions about sexuality and how the body moves, particularly a white male body within the popular culture, with the shaking of the hips and so forth and so on. Now, to what degree his love for and theft of, you know, that's for somebody else to dispute. I just remember every Sunday afternoon there was an Elvis movie on, and I just have a strange sort of thoughts about Elvis, Michael Jackson, and Speed Racer. They seem to be the same.
Then just one more thing, and I may have gotten this part really wrong. I'm an obsessive note taker from elementary school, but I have here, just on the heels of talking about it, black man as a white man acting black, I think you said black as tragic and cannot truly occupy its other. So that last part I don't understand, if you wouldn't mind just kind of going over that again. Thanks.
You know, I don't want to say it's right there and it's only there. I believe that you know, the current context will change. Blackness oftentimes is represented by other as a tragic being or a state of being, a context. And because in spite of all of the efforts to be less tragic, you're moving towards the opposite, and you could never occupy the position of the opposite. So what it exposes to me is, for me, the interest lies not in the extremes, but in the tertiary range between them, is the negotiation of power. You know, and, you know, I was listening earlier to Chris Smith's talk, and he talked about certain images that he projected, and he mentioned the body, and he put himself in a certain positions at certain times, and it was like, I got it. It's like, wow. I looked at a number of images over the years, but I never thought about, really in depth about how the black body and the white body exchange certain kinds of energies within the popular culture context. And it made sense in many regards, that when he was talking about Josephine Baker's and describing the two-dimensional representation of a moving figure, you know, I can't really explain, but it's something about about the negotiation of power between concepts of two polar opposites, for a lack of a better way of explaining it.
Mia.
When Kennedy Wiley poses kids from the street in certain art history, Napoleon on a horse or something like that. Is that kind of related to what you just said?
I think it's an appropriation. It's a use of a concept of blacks or blackness appropriating Western culture and Western ideas. I think the work mimics not only the poses, but really this it strips down the movement, and it really kind of leaves it static, and you're stuck, right? And I'm always asking questions with any of the images I see of his, because they're so static for me, despite the emphasis on color and variation, size, shapes, and whatnot. My movement is around often and definitely within that surface, but it's very static. It's a progressive read from the exterior towards the interior. And I think that's it's not an easy thing to do, by the way, especially with so much color and oftentimes bright, intense color that he often uses in this work. So I think it's a wonderful position to be able to put a viewer in. I, on the other hand, have not been able to do that. I drop things out, and I cannot get that kind of sterile feel to present a challenge like that.
Mia.
I want to thank you for Beware, which I post on I have projected at the beginning of every semester for the first class to warn my students. But you mentioned something about being really interested in tapping into sort of American iconography and related that immediately to blackface minstrelsy, which I think is typically coded black. But in a lot of your work, I also see tapping into a kind of Americana that most people think of as being more innocuous and therefore coded white. Things like the Pillsbury Doughboy or Mickey Mouse, and then rendering them in such a way that they seem sinister. And for me, that's like, I've read it as a kind of commentary on sort of this low buzz within that kind of innocuous, white bread American culture of a sinister underbelly. There's something, you have to beware of these images. There's something scary about them. And I'm wondering, but I can't always detect where that's coming from. And I wonder if that's something that you think about in your own work, and if you sort of have a point of origin for that and what you're trying to do when you give us the Pillsbury Doughboy, but not, in a sinister way, or Mickey Mouse telling us to beware.
Well, I think, again, it's language, it's a collective consciousness of American culture. And I know how it's represented, and I try to think of ways that folks can intersect that image. And for me, I could only do one thing with it, and it's take it away from where it is. I could add to it, but in that particular case, I chose to take it away from where it is. But you also got to think about my references within in my work. It's referencing oftentimes popular culture, which at times have often put me in an interesting place in terms of the minds of viewers about quality and value within the context of high art and low art. So often than not, the art world is in constant flux and looking for its next now. And I have this thought that if you're so far ahead, there's no need to continue to look ahead. Everything is behind you, and that's what the art world is like. So hence, pop art, for example, and all of the depth that comes with it. And at the bottom of it, we could go with Warhol, but at the bottom of it, it's minstrelsy.
Could I interject here for one quick moment and show you all a couple of more images? So if you see this figure, we've seen him, Al Jolson, before. Here he has the crocodile on his foot. Here is a kind of Christ figure or hooded figure that appears in another couple of works. I'm going to actually go back. Where I'm going with this, though, is that it's a longer history of icons and iconography that comes back to Roman art that you can see in Mediterranean art, that you can see in Egyptian art, that then keeps coming forward. The image of the crocodile, of the pygmy or the dwarf, the watermelon from Americana. So there is an archive of images that you have created by doing research in books and looking at images that you access and then put into your works. And you can't always say where they come from, but there they are.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both so much for this conversation. I wanted to ask you a question about the performer's gloves and your two-dimensional representation of motion, because you've talked about those performer's gloves, and it's made me attend to the way that you use hands and compose the hands of the characters in your work, and with this or the lack of performer's gloves. In this instance, I think I'd love to know more. I'd love to hear you talk more about the motion of the performers. Right? For instance, with the clown, his performer's gloves give a real strong stillness, almost despondency to his image.
Oh, there's some hands.
There's some more hands there. There's some more performer's gloves. In Beware, there's a lot of motion from the gloves going up in the gate, and you also get a sense of motion from the signal of whistling. And so I'd love to hear more about the importance of motion and/or the importance of hands and the composition of hands in giving a variety of meanings to the icons that you're using and the symbols you're using.
You know, a lot of times it was design, you know, and I can't tell you so much so that I was paying a lot of attention to, well, there were times when I paid more attention to hands than others. I think if it had the chance to being more relevant within constructing meaning, I would obviously pay more attention to it. But, you know, I talked about the entertainer's glove. We talked last night about that, and it's something that's quite consistent in minstrelsy, and you don't see it, and you see it with clowns and with mimes, for example. And I guess my introduction to it was looking at cartoons as a kid and seeing Bugs Bunny and even Mickey Mouse, and then the bomb blowing up in their face, and it was blackface, but I didn't know it. But it was something I always questioned about those things. And the more I look back, and I was able to make those connections. So the presence of the past is important to me, and it's in my work. I don't think that any new language can be created without being grounded in the past, and it's how we measure our progress. So I'm bringing things forward, and they stay as long as they're relevant, and when they're no longer relevant, they'll drop off.
Meta.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Gwendolyn, for organizing the conference. My question actually, and thanks, Jillian, for your introduction, it's actually about gender, and I'm glad you asked about hands, because I wanted to ask about gender and racial masquerade and hair, and from a formalist place. So when Cherise, you opened with a discussion of your book and talking about racial masquerade and appropriation and artistic performance, all of the artists in that particular work, although I know you also write about Michael Way's work, were women, right? And I'm really curious because when I have talked about or first introduced to my students like Carrie James Marshall's work, and I don't tell them first the gender, though what happens and how they read images based on their assumption of his gender as female and how that impacts their viewership and interpretation of the images. And so I'm glad we're at this image because I wanted to ask both Michael Ray and you, Cherise, how much, to what extent does our own viewership's assumptions about the identity of the artist, not the racial, but the gender identity of the artist, influence the way we read, interpret, or critique forms of racial masquerade, right? So if, for example, with the NBA's Fantastic piece, all this is years before Don Imus's comment, right, that was so controversial. Looking at it, obviously, years later, the formal gender of your use of the lines, of course, evokes Topsy and other kinds of racial iconography that gets gendered black and female. And so then, even though it's the NBA, you also have the later popular culture read back into that image of how women in the WNBA later, much later, get read. But if you look at the image that was at the Daily Circus, the line from the hair, formally what I was really interested in cuts, if you go back, oh yes, excuse me. If you go there, formally it cuts out daily, right, which would be the temporal intersection with the permanent,
Yeah,
and
permanent
you get ailey,
circus.
so you get, right, in the circus, right, so you get what ails you, right? What is ailing, what's haunting, what's hurting, right? And so I'm curious to what extent for you as an artist that's read as male, right, how that influences the way people read gender or masculinity or femininity and your racialized kind of critiques of appropriation, right? I'm really, if you've had any feedback in terms of viewer interaction.
You know, that's a good question, and thank you for that. And I do hope that you chime in at some point. But I could tell you that early on I was interested in, I started to look at popular culture and moreover hip-hop culture. And there were certain characteristics that were present. And I wanted to employ them in my work. And it was, early on, it was a language that came from black youth. And never before in the history of American culture did black youth have that much control over what they said and how they say. For example, NWA. And hip hop was colorful, it was bright, it was bold, it was unapologetic. And it was confrontational. And those were ideas that are staples in my work. Confrontational, unapologetic, colorful, bright. I mean, I wanted them to have a presence in any context. So I was really thinking about the production that I was receiving as a 17, 18, 19-year-old through hip-hop culture. And of course, hip-hop was a lot different then. But then we get to the 90s and it gets harsher and rougher and rawer and so forth.
I'm going to have to think about that question. It's an interesting one, but the thing that I am struck by is that there are very few female characters or figures that appear in his work. And when they do appear, they are often as symbols of objectification. So that's another thing to think about.
Thank you.
I had a question. I had a question which came out of your question, Cherise, to Michael Ray about performing a professorial
Yeah.
identity. And I was thinking about the class that I teach, which I'm teaching this semester, called Fake, which is about forgeries of all different kinds. And some of them, about half of the class is on, art forgeries and forgers and what makes an object not right. And then the other part is on forged identities and faked identities and assumed identities. And the first identity, when I ask my students how fake identity or assumed identities come into play in the contemporary moment, this iteration of the class, the first identity that came up was Rachel Dolezal, who's this woman, now I guess in her late 30s, who got an MA, an MFA, right, from Howard University in painting, adopted an identity for herself that was as a black female, although she was born to hear her parents tell it as a white female, and they outed her later when there was a family dispute. But she becomes a professor, and she becomes involved in the NAACP, and she works for black rights on campus, and is a very interesting artist. When you look at her paintings,
Absolutely.
they're very interesting on a lot of levels. And I captured her website because I was afraid it was going to come down, like when the controversy struck. But it was very interesting to me that my students immediately talked about that, and that in the critique of Dolezal, who was not performing for the stage. I mean, maybe as a professor she was performing, but she wasn't a performer in the way that we've talked about some of these performers. And so I was curious to get both of your responses in thinking about what it means to perform a racial masquerade as a job, or as an artist, like the artist that you worked on in your book, who are capitalizing on the fact that they've done this racial masquerade. When Dolezal, by all accounts, and I assume that she never meant to have that masquerade exposed. That was not her intention. Her intention was to live her life in that identity. So I'm curious, because I don't think we've talked about her in personal conversations, but given that question you asked Michael Ray about performing the professorial identity, for her to take on that identity in that context, in a pedagogical context, where she's teaching people about black culture and pretending, or not pretending, but living a black life. How do we work through that? I'm not teaching that in my class. I'm not teaching her as a case study, because I don't know what to make of it yet.
Can I start here?
Sure.
I wrote an op-ed on this right after it happened, and what I think there were a couple of things at stake. The first is that the larger American culture does not understand why someone who has white privilege would want to be black. That's the very first thing that we have to think about. Why she did it, I can't say, but I think from what she says and from what you say, there is an altruism to it, right? There is an affinity, a real identification with black culture. And in my thinking, I think, who am I, or who are we to stop her from being the thing that she wants to be? So I also have that real feeling about it. What interested me in the Dolezal case was her parents' investment in her whiteness, and her parents' investment in policing, not just of her having whiteness, but then in policing her whiteness, and I think in turn their own whiteness. And so that they needed to perform this discipline of her was the most remarkable thing to me. But this, I think, is a take that the not judging her for assuming a black identity is, I think it is not the norm. I think most people of African descent, most African Americans, were very angry with her for having appropriated what they feel is theirs. Now, I understand the ownership of Black culture, but it doesn't belong to us. It is something that we all make, that we all participate in, just like the larger American culture. But again, I think that's a kind of minority opinion that I have.
I would agree with much of what you said. I mean, it's all language, and it's all produced within the cultural context. I think the backlash came from, again, ownership. What audacity that she has to perform Blackness, her version of Blackness. And I'm not judging her, whether she's right or wrong. I think we all have choices, and that was her choice. And it wasn't done in a way, I think, that was exaggerated and for that was degrading to Blacks. You know, she performed in the context of her life, and she was quite productive in many ways in her life. So I think it's all language, and people appropriate language as they seem, as they feel necessary. Regarding the performance of the professorial performance, you know, I believe in the artist as an intellectual. And there are scientists, there are mathematicians, there are whatever within the academic setting. And we all are producing knowledge, we all are producing, and to some degree, value with the knowledge that we produce. Where some disciplines are quite restricted in terms of you know, how things are produced. I think an artist has the ability to borrow from all disciplines. So I never thought of myself as performing as a professor. And you know, at times when I'm in a room with her and she's in meetings, like, damn, she says all the right things, right? And she does all the right things, at least so far. No, it really inspires me. And then there are other examples. Yourself, for example, Eric, and now Chris and others I've met. I mean, we all are performing to a certain degree. I can't tell you that I haven't looked at how she's done things or others have done things and try to pattern myself in a way within the given context. Yes, I do that. But I think I'm an artist, you know, who happens to teach.
The one thing that I would add to that, and Zoe will be the last questioner, is that there were really high-profile examples of people being outed as not being Native in that same time period, right? So wasn't there Elizabeth Warren, and who claimed to have Cherokee identity, which was later questioned, and then there was the poet at UC Riverside, whose name I can't remember. Yeah, and Sherman Alexie wrote a very long article that is worth reading about why she should be included even if she is not what she has claimed to be. So I think increasingly this gatekeeping is a little bit less closed than it has been in the past.
You know, there's a series of commercials, Ancestry.com, and there's one I saw recently where a woman said, you know, I thought I was Mexican American. And then I did this, and I realized I'm a large percentage of Native American. And now I'm exploring this. And then there's a guy, I was like, I thought I was Italian. Yeah, we thought we were Italian. And then he realized that he wasn't Italian. And the other guy, he was German. Yeah, we used to do all these German type things, and I'm Italian. it's cultural appropriation and in use, and one of the interesting things about, I think, living today is that there is this thing called, this closet called history that we could all reach into and pick and choose. What do we want to pull out and exercise within a contemporary context? But I would say you should understand how systems of meaning work and where the intersections are when using those things.
Zoe, last one.
It's too tall. I'm going to try to masquerade as a tall person right now. In the movie Imitation of Life, one of Piola's dilemmas was access. And she passes as white because she thinks and understands that in that time, that lightness and whiteness is associated with privilege to spaces that were not denied to her. Cherise, your question about performing in academia, and Michael Ray, your response made me think about that film, as well as the TV series Black and White by Ice Cube. And there's definitely a performing that I recognize by me and by others when I'm interacting with folks in a room or interacting in a room of colleagues that are predominantly white, male, and straight. Whether my behavior is one of resistance or subversiveness, or even silence. What are some of the strategies that you both use to negotiate those kinds of spaces and expectations of who and why you are and how you are?
Well, for me, context is important. You know, I'm not a big black man. I'm tall. Some people would think I'm big. In the context of a classroom, I've really had to, over the years, understand that I can't stand and express what I'm seeing in terms of what the student is producing. I've had students cry, and it took me time after time, every semester. It's like, and most of them were white girls, and they would cry. I was like, God damn, what am I doing? And you know, I started to realize that I had to find a way to make myself smaller within that relationship. So I would sit, and sometimes I would sit on a stool that was lower than them. And I had to change the inflection of my voice at times. And in the context of meetings in academic environments, I think I have a dominant personality. I think I know. And she does as well, but she masks it better than I do, I think. I really have to be more selective of how who I engage at when, and how I do so. But you know, I've told you over the years I resist to exist, conform to disarm, assimilate. It's your faith.
That sounds awful. Assimilate, it's your fate. So this class, American Racial Performance in American Art and Culture, is something that I taught the very second semester that I became a professor. And at that point, I was not that many years out from the graduate students that I was teaching. And they knew that I wasn't very many years out. And in fact, I was just a semester out from being a graduate student. And they were not comfortable with my performance of being a professor. And even worse, I was not comfortable with my performance of being a professor. And so we had a very awkward time of it. But it was also awkward because we were thinking about racial performance, and I was the only person of color in the setting of the classroom. And so any concern, any aspect of guilt that they faced, they projected onto me. Well, what do you think? Well, why did this happen? And my family didn't own slaves. Is that okay? So there were these things that they required of me, and so they forced me to perform some blackness that I was not comfortable with performing for them and in that context. And so it took me a number of years to come back to that class. And when I did come back to the class, I had tenure. I was much more fully comfortable in being a professor, in owning this identity that's now mine and not something that I was performing to try to become. And then the last couple of times that I've taught it, I have had much more ethnically mixed classes. So it's made for a much more interesting, powerful dynamic. But just that experience was a really challenging one that I keep in my mind every time that I go into the classroom, that I don't want to become the object of the students' either black questions or guilt or any other emotion. So I'm sort of answering your question. There are other strategies that I try to employ.
You know, one of the things that I often think about are examples of authority and authorities with male figure authorities.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you. So I'm specifically asking about how you negotiate that with your colleagues,
Oh,
not
colleagues.
your students.
Oh.
I'm
Colleagues.
Not, I
Yeah.
know that's students. I don't have a problem with. It's
Yeah.
just your colleagues, which can be really challenging
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
because upper administration doesn't look like me or doesn't look like you. Typically doesn't, right?
Yeah.
It's not as diverse as we'd like it to be. So how do you handle that?
So one of the things that I'm often criticized for, and you're going to appreciate that, is that I don't smile enough. And I think that the smile is welcoming, inviting to colleagues and to students, and it disarms people. It makes you, I suppose, appear to be friendly and open and warm. I happen to be all those things and not smile a lot. So it's a challenging thing for colleagues. And like Michael, I have a tall issue that people are intimidated by me based on my height. How to counteract the intimidation, I haven't figured it out.
Those are good ones, Zoe. You know, I'm still trying to figure a lot of that stuff out because I find myself in another institution where I'm oftentimes, well, in this institution, I'm the only black in the School of Art, black person in the School of Art. In the previous one, up until when Cherise came in, it was 3 of us, John Yancey, but he was the chair. And oftentimes in painting, I was the only black person. I think the challenges was, for me, it was about, I often thought about invisibility, despite how large I am in the room. I often thought about invisibility, and I'll tell you why. Because when I was in grad school and studied art history, there wasn't very many depictions discussed about images of blacks within that context. Thank God we have these Bearden fellows here and here now, and others. And I achieved a sense of power and authority through my work being out in the art world. And with that cachet, that form of cash currency, I'm in a particular space in academia where I'm a minority up against a majority group of folks, but I have this thing called, my work is in art history books and not just black art history books, you know, so I'm knowledgeable about that, and I'm knowledgeable how to use it within, you know, certain contexts. So I know it's not the same case for a number of young professors or professors of color, and but it's not an easy fix. I think Cherise wrote an op-ed on invisibility as a woman of color in academia, and I'm telling you guys about this story about how I'm addressing students. There are times I have to do the same thing with colleagues, right? And then I'll ask myself, or I'll contemplate, what I just did, just to be able to communicate. And I'm wondering if they see my humanity.
Can I add to this that, and I know you're trying to close down, that a number of us are still the first. And that's absolutely remarkable that when I got tenure in 2011, the first Black person, the first person of color to get tenure in art history at UT.
Yeah.
And, well, thank you. But, and I'm not saying it because of that. What I'm saying is it's remarkable that this is still the case, that we are still integrating art in art history departments.
We are. It's when I was just going to say that when Cherise and I were at Stanford, I was the first Black PhD to finish in art history, and she was the second. And in our department in art history at Penn, we're still moving towards our first. So these are very real issues. They're very new for many people, but I really want to thank both of you for your conversation today, for coming. I want to thank all of my panelists who participated. I want to thank Eric Lott for the fantastic keynote last night. And I want to thank all of you for coming, and I want to thank all of you for staying for Sheldon's performance, which is coming up in just a little while tonight. If you didn't already do it on your social media and you have pictures that you've taken, hashtag racial masquerade, tweet it, put it on your Instagram, what have you. Feel free to be in touch with me, gshaw@upenn.edu, if you have thoughts or interests or concerns. And just a big round of applause.